As you have already surmised, I understand corruption in the sense of décadence. What I maintain is this, that all the values upon which mankind builds its highest hopes and desires are decadent values. I call an animal, a species, an individual corrupt when it loses its instincts, when it selects and prefers that which is detrimental to it. One of the most elusive, yet most frequently used words in Twilight of the Idols is the word décadence. Interestingly, Nietzsche prefers to use the French term, even though he sometimes uses German words like Verfall, Niedergang, or Entartung. In English, we can keep the French term or use words like degeneration or even corruption. In this video, we will take a deeper dive into this concept, specifically as it appears in Twilight of the Idols. This is part 2 in a planned series on this late work by Nietzsche. If you want to be notified when subsequent parts come out, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell button. Broadly speaking, the term décadence denotes a process by which some entity becomes worse over time. If, for example, you stop working out and lifting weights, you will lose muscle mass, and we can say your muscles start degenerating. Nietzsche uses the term to denote the process by which individuals, or even entire societies or time periods, become worse, or in other words, degenerate. Much of Twilight of the Idols is devoted to the description of how this process works and what that means exactly. However, in true Nietzschean fashion, we never find a real definition or sustained analysis of what degeneration is exactly. It's up to us, the readers, to piece things together and make a coherent picture out of disparate parts and fragments. Is it possible that these great philosophers were, every one of them, a little shaky on their legs, effete, rocky, decadent? Nietzsche opens up Twilight of the Idols with an attack on the entire philosophical tradition before him. The entire Western philosophical tradition, starting with Socrates, has made a mistake. In all ages, the wisest have always agreed in their judgment of life. It is no good. At all times and places, the same words have been on their lips, words full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of weariness of life, full of hostility to life. This first sentence of Twilight of the Idols immediately sets the tone. Nietzsche is taking a stand against the entire tradition, and he does so in a very radical way. We are not talking about a minor disagreement here. Nietzsche is going to claim the complete opposite of what the great philosophers of the past have all agreed upon, that life is not worth living, or at the very least, that life is full of suffering. How could it be that the smartest and greatest philosophers of the past have all been wrong on this fundamental question on the value of life? Is it that they were all stupid? Nietzsche calls this idea, the conviction that life is no good, the consensus sapientium, or the agreement of the wise. So no, he is not saying they are stupid. If the great sages of the past were not stupid, then why were they wrong? They were sick, they were decadent. The fact that all wise men agree on the valuation of life does not mean that their valuation is correct. Rather, it simply means they are all looking at life in the same way, that is to say, in a decadent way. Nietzsche argues that valuations of life are not a matter of being objectively true or false. Judgments and valuations of life, whether for or against, cannot be true. Their only value lies in the fact that they are symptoms. They can be considered only as symptoms. Per se, such judgments are nonsense. In other words, when Schopenhauer is proclaiming that life is horrible and that the world is a hell, we are not really learning anything about life or the world. The statement says more about Schopenhauer himself than it does about the world. The difference is subtle but significant. Humans cannot accurately judge the value of life because they are an interested party. A true objective appraisal of life is impossible. A living man cannot estimate life because he is a contending party, or rather the very object in the dispute and not a judge. Nor can a dead man estimate it, for other reasons. As such, we must treat appraisals of life not as regular statements, but we must interpret them as symptoms. What kind of man comes to the conclusion that life is not worth living? Only a sick man, Nietzsche argues. For a philosopher to see a problem in the value of life is almost an objection against him, a note of interrogation set against his wisdom, a lack of wisdom. What? Is it possible that all these great sages were not only decadents, but that they were not even wise? It is well known that Socrates was ugly and a bit of a clown in Athenian society. Nietzsche says Socrates was the lowest of the low, not of noble birth, a peasant, and he belongs to the mob. What kind of power does such a person have? An ugly face in ancient Greek society was indicative of an ugly soul. Such a weak man as Socrates only has one weapon to yield: reason. Reason and dialectics, the discussion, the debate. The strong have no need for fancy words and arguments. The strong command, the weak convince. A man resorts to dialectics only when he has no other means to hand. People know that they excite suspicion with it and that it is not very convincing. Nothing is more easily dispelled than a dialectical effect. This is proved by the experience of every gathering in which discussions are held. It can only be the last defense of those who have no other weapons. Nietzsche argues that Socrates' preoccupation with reason was nothing more than a consequence of his weak and ugly constitution, and he argued that Athenians started to take him seriously because Athenian society was becoming weaker. He saw right through his noble Athenians. He perceived that his case, his peculiar case, was no exception even in his time. The same kind of degeneracy was silently preparing itself everywhere. Ancient Athens was dying out, and so we have set the tone for the rest of Western civilization. Starting with the Greeks, we have become preoccupied with reason and debate. From Socrates onward, reason becomes a tyrant. We must always be reasonable, always rational. We must suppress our instincts and base desires. This is the path to virtue and happiness, we are told. However, Nietzsche says all of this is a big misunderstanding. The most blinding light of day, reason at any price, life made clear, cold, cautious, conscious, without instincts, opposed to the instincts, was in itself only a disease, another kind of disease, and by no means a return to virtue, to health and to happiness, to be obliged to fight the instincts. This is the formula of degeneration. As long as life is in the ascending line, happiness is the same as instinct. We find here the greatest cause of degeneration, the primacy of reason, or, in other words, a disregard for human instinct. The implications are myriad. In this definition of decadence, we find the kernel of Nietzsche's entire philosophy. We see how Nietzsche appreciates the body again, champions strength. We see amor fati and saying yes to life. We see will to power. We see a rejection of any kind of hinterwelt. We can trust our senses again, because remember, it was reason, through Plato, Descartes, and Kant, that told us our senses, our body, they all lie to us. Now that reason has been unmasked as a big misunderstanding, we become free to appreciate the world once more as it appears to us. Decadence as epistemology and metaphysics, distrust of the senses, reason as the only weapon instead of being a weapon of last resort. A total flipping on its head of the natural state of things. So, what is needed in return? We must flip everything back to the way it was. We must undertake a transvaluation of all values. We have seen decadence as metaphysics in this part. In the next part, we will look at decadence as morality, morality as the enemy of nature. Stay tuned for part 3, and please subscribe if you want to be notified when this video comes out. In the meantime, you can watch our deep analysis of 6 pages in Twilight of the Idols entitled How the Real World Became a Myth. And if you want more deep dives, we also have an hour-long video on Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.